hey, I'm a diagnosed narcissist, and I want to talk about love bombing and how I sorta, well, not even sorta, I see the entirety of it as a form of a love language, if you will. Now, that might sound crazy and absolutely absurd to like a lot of you, but I know I think and perceive differently than most people, so I'm gonna go about explaining why I think that is, because I've been thinking about this for, quite some time. Essentially, I know people see love bombing as a tool to take advantage of somebody and, use them, get something over on them, and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And I'm aware that could very well much happen. And by the way, love bombing is not exclusive to narcissists alone. Any, let's say, person with an agenda can do it. So I think it's kind of stupid when people just want to associate that whole thing with like just a thing with like narcissists alone, but that's besides the point. I wanted to talk about how when I think of love bombing, I sort of just see it as a way to be love bombed myself. And this is because I have issues with object constancy. It's hard for me to imagine that somebody can look at me and think that I'm still a decent person, but also have like flaws or something. Because in my, I guess to a lot of people, like black and white point of view, where I can either only be all good or all bad, or the way I look at other people where they can only either be all good or all bad, it doesn't really, compute. But I don't know. To me, it's too contradictory, and I think that's kind of why I'm annoyed at like existence, like in general, because like we're supposed to expect that like the good times highlight the bad times and like whatever and like all that kind of stuff. I mean, in a hierarchy of like how I think the world, operates, that simply cannot be. Like one has to dominate over the other, which is why I don't actually think love is a real thing. I think it's a great and wonderful feeling to perform and be a part of, but it's still technically not even like a real thing. I was even having a conversation. I'm not sure if it was. No, I don't think it was last night. Well, at one point, I had a conversation, and I was even talking about how, like, okay, when a mother gives birth to her child, and then, I heard immediately after she releases, like, oxytocin in her brain, and that essentially attaches her to the child, then it got me thinking, like, what if that simply didn't happen? Because a lot of people associate that love psychologically to the oxytocin that the mother feels after she gives birth, and that's why essentially she can excuse the whole, oh my gosh, I've been in pain during labor, blah, blah, this and this and that, and now I'm satisfied because my freaking baby is here, and now I'm fulfilling the biological drive that I feel compelled to pursue, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if any of you out there don't want children, don't get your panties in a bunch. I know you exist. I know you exist. But, yeah, it's no different than a drug. Like, because when you take drugs, it feels some sort of like, I don't know, like chemical release in your head, like whatever the words are, like what is it, dopamine, all that kind of shit, serotonin, blah blah blah, this and that. And I was kind of thinking like, how would love be any different? Because when you like hug your partner, for example, yeah, I think it also releases essentially like oxytocin. Like they say oxytocin is basically the chemical responsible for like what we perceive as love and all that stuff. So I imagine any forms of physical intimacy, holding hands, yeah, I already said hugging, yeah, you know, kissing, whatever, all that kind of stuff, it, wires our brain to be hooked on some sort of like fix. And to me, I think love bombing just becomes the ultimate catalyst. And the way I sort of like rationalize it is that like I'm essentially love bombing someone to get love bombed back in return. Because basically it ends up becoming a mirror of itself. If I'm very successful at like love bombing, where to the point where even at least like in that moment you can't fathom like anything bad about me, then obviously you'll reciprocate feelings of like appreciation, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. And then it'll just be like we'll be like two ping pong paddles, just like motioning back and forth until eventually there comes a drop. Because you know people fight, people get into disagreements and conflicts and tricky sort of like situations. But then what do they need to compensate it? to me it looks like the same thing. Like it's literally just like love bombing again. Like why do people have like makeup sex to like begin with? Because even if they're not gonna like outright say it, they're trying to trigger back those like chemicals in their brain that essentially manipulate themselves into like, you know, not caring about like the fight anymore. And I know a lot of people are gonna be like, oh, well, we're not supposed to like excuse it. We're supposed to like, you know, talk things out, you know, actually like get over it, not just like sweep everything like under the rug. And I'm just like, you know, that's all fine and dandy. But it's like, you know, that's just a better way to cope, I think, with what actually happened. Like I guess, and you'll say it's because of like my hierarchical thinking, I imagine, but like okay, if you were fighting with somebody, that's all that there was like in that moment. So even if you all the way in the future, well, like to the present point now, look at it as like, oh my gosh, why were we even fighting about that? It's so silly, it's so this, it's so that. It's just because simply you chose to like let it go. But if you people are so strong in terms of like, oh my gosh, your identity and like who you are, then why would you not acknowledge that like all you were in that situation was like uncomfortable? You didn't understand why your partner was doing this. You didn't understand why, I don't know, your like friend was doing like this or that, because oh, love supposedly manifests in like so many forms, like love for a partner, love for a friend, love for your dog, whatever, like all that kind of stuff. Or like even pets, for example. Like, you know, we pet dogs and I think like it releases like the chemicals essentially. Like everything is simply just the chemicals. And I think we as people are essentially just dependent upon this thing called love, and it's like no different than like a drug addiction basically. Like I know there's obviously an idea of like unhealthy relationships that like people talk about, but like when people idealize a healthy relationship, I think the only reason it doesn't get looked at as a bad thing than let's say like a heroin addiction, a crack addiction, or like something like that, is because it doesn't necessarily show like any physical effects that are like depressing. Like you're not like a fucking tweaker or meth head, for example, that's like picking at their skin, doing this, doing that. It's just like, oh wow, that couple over there, they're holding hands or they're putting their, you know, arms around each other and they're like so in love. But it's just like, why are they doing it? It's just the chemical wirings and like essentially like all the processes inside that are like making it go about. So under the same breath, you could even say like, yeah, why are people chasing drugs? Because they want that same chemical dependency that like they have, you know, in their mind, and you know, all that kind of stuff. So to me, I know it's just a performance, a very like enjoyable performance, but like admittedly I see it as just like, oh, that's the truth of like the matter. Because like, you know how they even talk about how like, see, this is what I think is like so sketchy about love, or like how so like inconsistent like it actually is. Because you know, people are always going about how like you're supposed to talk about things, you're supposed to, you know, like make something, you know, like obviously like work and all that kind of stuff. But it's like the narrative will change depending on what like sort of ideology benefits in that like particular sort of like situation. Because then people are going to stress about how like there needs to be forgiveness in a relationship, there needs to be, you know, more understanding, and you know, a willingness to like compromise, yada yada yada, this and this and that. But then like it's all arbitrary. So if we were to just be honest about it, we're just idealizing a form where like a form, I don't know if that's the right word, but okay, we're just idealizing a moment where, oh yeah, we were so happy, and then we want to go back to that. Because when you and a person are arguing or something like that, like of course the more you hypothetically argue and like don't get along, it'll shatter the illusions of like love that you've had before, where you weren't fighting and this and this and that. So like essentially you're just recreating an idea that technically doesn't even like exist anymore. Because you know, imagine when people are fighting or like they break up or like somebody's trying to get back with somebody, it's like they're trying to remind you of like the good times. So in actuality, they're not facing the uncomfortable situation now. But even when people are supposedly dealing with like a hard and like difficult sort of like situation, kind of like what I've just said, what are they trying to recreate? Old feelings that are technically not even like relevant now. So it just gets plastered on, layered on, and yada 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 yada. So I'm just like, so if you have oxytocin, whatever, all that sorts of like it's easy to manipulate yourself into thinking that like, oh, there's progress for this, progress for that. But I'm just like, it's filling a void though. It's filling a void though. Because I don't know, you might say it's my extreme black and white like thinking again, but it's just like I kind of find it hard to believe that like there isn't such a person that's like, codependent or something. Like I know people are always saying that like you should have a firm like, understanding of like yourself, which I guess I wouldn't understand because yes, I do struggle, if that's what you want to call it, with like object constancy and like things like that. But it's just like the way I see it, I'm just like there's so much incongruencies, there's so much like inconsistencies, because like if you're going to tell me that like you don't actually need somebody, then why aren't majority of people out in the woods, like living like hermits? Like to me it's like there are straightforward conclusions and there are like straightforward ways that like people could be consistent with like what they say. But when I talk to people or even just like observe how people perceive love and like all this kind of stuff, like it just seems like a big like fucking like circus act where kind of like what I said, where it's like they'll say anything depending on like when it's like convenient. Because how often can you see somebody switch up to, oh, you should still stand on your own, versus, oh, you guys need to like work together? But I'm just like, why do you need to work together? Because like hypothetically, I think if you were so strong on the whole just focus on yourself thing, well, not really focus on yourself, but I guess like, feel confident like within yourself, no one should ever be disappointed that they went through a breakup or something. Or like the way I would see it, I think like the only valid emotion to like actually go through with a breakup is just like the frustration and like annoyance that like, oh, you had all that like time wasted. But like even if you're gonna say, oh, I still enjoyed like the happy times with that person, like why? It doesn't even exist anymore. It's just memories in your head, but it's not even real. It's not even like relevant anymore. Because if you can be in a relationship with somebody and then hypothetically you reach a path where you guys like broke up and like all that stuff, I don't know, to me at least it clearly indicates that none of that actually needed to happen. So love is essentially a projection. Love does not actually exist, but kind of like what I've said before, and I'll circle it back, it's a fun performance to like engage in. So I don't fault anybody for essentially just going through some sort of like role play, I guess. And the only difference is that like, oh, this isn't a story, this isn't a book, this is real life, so that somehow makes it like more important, even though like nah, like love, anything that we find like joy in, like the way I see it, like it's all just filling a bottomless void up until we die. Because we can fill ourselves up with these ideas of love, these ideas of, let's say, and that's all fine. But I feel like I'm just the only person that can admit like, okay, it's all just like escape. And like people want to talk about how like love is the most like powerful feeling in the world or something. Like it's not even like that different. So, I'm guessing a lot of you wouldn't agree with me, but I'm just like, let's keep love bombing for fun, because love makes the world go round, I guess. And if we're all delusional idiots happy in love, then, well, there you go.